Hi, my name's Jesse Lynn.
And I'm Angela Lynn. Welcome back to another episode of But Where Are You Really From? Today is our last episode of this kind of batch before we take another break, and we are ending on July 4th weekend. So obviously we are revisiting our old topic from season 1 when we still had seasons called Red, White, and You, revamped for 2022. And this is actually an interesting topic because I'm in Asia right now. We pre-record, but I will still be in Asia at the time of this publishing anyway. So it is an interesting kind of like position to be in, to be revisiting the topic of like, what does being American mean to us? But before we go into all of that, I think for our open, we just want to do a little mathy math. How old is America nowadays?
I'm going to guess 235. No.
Final
it can't
answer.
Be a round number. 238. Oh, it's 238.
I don't know. I didn't actually do the math.
Oh, I thought you were Googling in the background.
No. I mean, I can just do the calculator.
How old is the
1776.
U.S.?
246. What did you say?
Okay, I was close. 238 or something like that.
Oh, whatever. 246. Isn't it bizarre? Isn't it like crazy town that we are only 246 years old as a country? Like, it sounds ancient to us. Like 1776
Sure.
sounds like an ancient year, but because we talk about being Asian all the time and like the new things we learn from our parents and stuff about our own history from, China days, it's like, that shit's thousands of years old. I'm like, 246, that's like barely one dynasty or whatever within China's history. So it's kind of wild.
It's really interesting because, like, it's not even that the country has been around for so long, but it's, like, the actual history, as you mentioned. For example, when we were doing the Ukraine episodes, Ukraine's only been a country since the 90s, but Ukraine has had history back into, like, ages and ages ago. So not only are we a new a new country.
We got stock options.
We are just a company now. It's just a capitalist company. All of the United States. No, not only are we a new country, but the culture of our country is very, very fresh, new, always evolving.
Yeah, I think that's honestly the difference. And we've discussed this in our past episode, and I think the reason why we renamed this episode the same episode name essentially as what we did 2 years ago is because we wanted to see how our own reflections of what being American means to us has changed even just within these 2 years. And I think that is kind of the main thing that makes the US very different from most other countries, which is just that because our whole shtick is being this melting pot, our history is not really about like, oh, well, we just got colonized by these people, so we became that was the culture then, and then we got colonized by those people, and then we became that culture. Yes, faux show colonization happened, and we did, different civilizations did come to try to take over things, but the kind of spirit of 1776 onwards America is that it was all the kind of like people who left other countries to try to create something new that like didn't exist before. And honestly, the big break was to say like, we don't want kings anymore. Like that shit's done. Like we just want to like figure out our own way of like living.
Well, and religious freedom. Let's not forget about religious freedom.
That's true. God is always part of the story, isn't he?
Speaking of pre-recording, I'm not sure if you saw the news yet, but there was that leaked draft of the Supreme Court Roe v. Wade overturning. So we do want to like encapsulate that here because I do think that it'll be an interesting discussion point as to, I think just generally like how America works and how passionate people are about American politics, including stuff that's like usually pretty dry and boring, like the courts, right? Like who usually courts?
Yeah.
So.
Well, we don't need to get into like the actual abortion topic, at least not right now, but I do think one of the like another key difference of like what makes America America compared to a lot of other countries is this whole like federal versus state BS. Not BS. I just mean like there is a very strong distinction, and the like weird kind of like they work together but not really. Like the states are kind of independent but not really. Because honestly, when I first read that headline about the Roe versus Wade potential overturn, I was freaking out because I was like, wait, that's a federal decision. So at first I thought like, oh, so does that mean like all across the nation abortion would be illegal? Exactly. That I saw, then I like clicked a few more links and I was like, okay, so it's state by state. It's more that the current states that have it as legalized because it's federally officially a right would have the right to overturn their state laws to say like, oh, we never wanted this anyway, so now it's illegal again for y'all, as opposed to like states like California that are super liberal would never overturn it.
Yeah. It's really about, I mean, if you want to look at it without the human perspective, returning the right to the state to make that decision as opposed to the federal government. Obviously, like, all the states that didn't want it had been kind of limiting the accessibility of abortion anyway, so it was like really curtailed. But federally, it meant that every state had to kind of like follow the federal guidance of like what you have to do. But now it's kind of like, well, each state has the decision in deciding those rights as part of its like statehood or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
And actually, I mean, to be fair, I don't know shit about governments in general, even our own. But even when I was saying all this, I was like, actually, I feel like COVID really highlighted that the US is not the only place where like little regions also make like completely different decisions. Because, for example, like when we were in Spain for a wedding, I mean, it was like county by county, they were changing like what was okay and what wasn't, considering the exact same COVID circumstances. So yeah, maybe we're not that special. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I think we just have a distinct flavor of of that. I mean, if we're looking at Spain for a comparison, I just think that their government is much more of a coalition than ours is, because they don't have that many parties, but they have at least 3 major parties that share the power somewhat equally. Versus here, it's a 2-party system. So if you're either one or the other, or you can't really do much, versus like there's at least some coalition. Anyways, we can get into it. I'm very interested in this topic.
Okay.
In my perspective, I could be wrong. Sorry, Spanish people.
Sorry, Ramon left. He's not here to defend his own people.
Next time.
Lols. Okay, let's wrap back to the like original kind of topic area. So what does being American mean to you, and how has that changed in the last 2 years since we asked ourselves these questions?
It's such a hard thing to reflect on because it's not something you think about every day, because it's not connected to like thousands of years of history, like your heritage. And even if it were, we're born of immigrant families, right? So it's not our heritage anyways. So it's just something that I don't think about a lot. I think that the last time we discussed it, we were very closely connecting how your pride in living here with the current situation in the government. And if you were to ask the question to me like that, I would still say the needle hasn't moved much. Like, I think from the optics perspective, some sanity has been restored in terms of just like the general blah 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 around the presidency has returned to like its boring status as we, I guess most people were kind of like prefer it to be. But the reality of the situation for a lot of people, and the reality of what the political engine, if you will, has produced since Joe Biden was elected as the president, has not really changed a lot. And so from my perspective, like, I don't feel net positive about the situation. I don't feel net negative either, because I don't think anything has like really slid off the table. But overall, I would say like expectations are not being met, because there were a lot of things that I think people, myself included, we're looking for the new administration, which has control of all of Congress and the executive branch, waiting for them to kind of like make the moves on all of these legislative promises that they had stated that they would deliver on and still have not. And that's where I'm at. I think like I know like talking with you, like you've shut out a lot of just there's been so much like negative news and stuff, and I just feel like more and more it's hard to determine how much of that is representative of what's actually happened, right? Because you see like Asian woman attacked, Asian woman shot, then you have like school shooting, like, and it's so much that it's hard for you to determine like, oh shit, like is the core fabric of society really like warping into, you know, the toilet, or is it just like there's more reporting because that's kind of what reporting does now to like get eyeballs and clicks and whatever. So from that perspective, like how I feel about, if you want to say the moral fabric of the country, like my pride there, I don't know. I'm not sure. Like I'm always glass half full, I feel like in these situations. I'd like to believe that people are more like, you know, like as we discussed, I like to believe that people have more in common than they do different, but it's hard to tell. What about you?
There's a lot to unpack from what you just said. I want to first offer a resource, which is one of my friends gave me this resource recently, and I was like, oh, this is wonderful, which is you mentioned the thing about like it's really difficult now to tell like if things are really as bad as they are given the way news is reporting whatever. On Instagram there's an account called Ground News, and they basically highlight different headlines and show underneath the breakdown of the percentage of either left-wing sources, centrist sources, or right-wing sources that reported on that headline, so that you can tell how biased that is. And it also shows like basically it gives you a chance to see like if I'm always following these types of news sources, I would have never even known that this thing happened because it's not being reported on by my like typical go-tos, versus like when I see the breakdown of this is like, oh well, centrist and right-wing or whatever are reporting this thing, and I would have wanted to know that, but the, you know, left sources aren't reporting that. Anyways, I really like it because it kind of shows you a more representative view of like what's actually happening, and also like which ones are really skewed based on who's reporting what. Yeah, I'm like, where do I go from where you left it? So I think for me, I will never let go of my core pride in being American, no matter where our country has gone in the last, let's call it the last 8 years or so, right? How much it has gone kind of up and down in that time frame. And for me, it still goes back to what I said in like our first episode of this. It's that I do buy in very strongly into the whole American dream thing. Is it perfect? No. But are we in one of the few countries where you do have the opportunity to, like, if you work really fucking hard, if you get a little bit of luck, because you always need a little bit of luck as well, but are you at a much higher possibility of achieving what you want to do than in a different country that doesn't offer you as much of this opportunity? I think the answer is still yes. And I'm biased because I literally just spent the last few days editing our Mother's Day episode that we've released by now. And especially coming from the real immigrant perspective, because you and I are not immigrants. We were born in the US. So I will kind of devil's advocate a different point you said earlier as well. But we're not the immigrants. Our parents were the immigrants. And when we asked both our parents, is there anything you regret about immigrating? Even after they mentioned all the hardships that they went through during that transition, especially your mom talking about feeling like so lonely and isolated and like having to start over and all that stuff. Even reflecting on all that, both of them said, no, there's nothing I regret about coming here. And my mom specifically said something like, the opportunities that you get by coming to this country are like unparalleled, and most people don't have that opportunity to come here. So like, I always, whenever I need kind of a reality check of like how lucky are we to be American, I always kind of look back to what actual immigrants think, especially if you talk to like fresh immigrants. Our parents have been in the US for decades by now and they still think that way. But if you talk to like fresh immigrants, like I'm sure if you talk to some recent war refugees, for example, that they would have a completely different perspective than we do on like what it means to be in this country and like the levels of freedom and like opportunity that they have just by not being in the situation they were in before. So part of me will always be prideful of being American just because it does symbolize this kind of like land of the free thing, right? Like, of course we have flaws. Of course we have a bunch of shit that's wrong with our country as well. But it is always that symbol, I think, in the global sphere of like, we stand for freedom. We're still kind of fucking it up in a lot of ways, but like that's our kind of core belief of like our founding mantra for this country. And we still try to move that forward. And we are still one of the biggest opportunity givers in the world right now. So for that, I'm always very proud. Going back to what you said of like, it's not our heritage because our families are not from the US. I fundamentally disagree with you because there is no American heritage in that sense. Like America, as we know it from 1776 onwards, is what everyone made of it, of all the immigrants that came to the US. So we're not Native American. So if you're saying like we're not from here because we're not Native American, sure, yeah, but like no one is really, we wiped most of them out, unfortunately. So you and I, having been born in the US, we are American. Like I don't identify as strongly with Taiwan as I do with the US. So if you want to say like which heritage are you like really, are you closest to, for me it's American. I'm trying really hard to kind of like climb back to the Taiwanese part because I know it's really important to be close to the mother culture, right? But which one do I associate myself more to? It's definitely the American culture. And we are both deeply American. Like it's a really hard concept to grasp. Like how would you describe being American and blah, blah, blah. But because I'm abroad right now, especially, my perspective is very different. Because I think when you leave the country is when you most recognize that you are American as fuck. Like you land somewhere else and everyone is like, oh my God, you're so American. You know what I mean? Like it's very easy for them to describe you like that versus like when you try to describe yourself, like, what does American mean? You're like, I don't know. But like you land anywhere else and they're like, oh, these fucking Americans, right? Like they like can pick you out everywhere. And even we'll talk about this more, or maybe we already have, because by the time we publish this episode, that episode will have been live already. But we reflect on my experience of being an Asian in Asia, but not the type of Asian in the country I'm at, right? And I'll give you a preview right now. When I'm in a different Asian country, I honestly, the thing I think I am the most is American. Like I don't, and when people ask like, where are you from or whatever, like I say America because it's not true to say I'm from Taiwan. I'm not from Taiwan. Like I can say like my family is from Taiwan or whatever, and that makes them feel a little, closer to me in a sense, because they're like, oh, so you're like Asian kind of, but like, I don't know if I told this story in that previous episode or not, but a perfect example is that 3 years ago when I lived in Japan for a few months, and I was working at Adobe still at that time, I had lunch with my coworkers who were Japanese. And we were in a Chinese restaurant that they chose. I was like, I definitely don't want to eat at a Chinese restaurant, but they chose it. They wanted it. And I made some comment about like, oh yeah, I've eaten this a lot because my family is Chinese. And they were like, wait, you're Chinese? And I was like, my last name's Lin. Like, what did you And they genuinely were just like, I don't know, you're just so American. I don't know, I just knew you were American. So they didn't even think about my ethnicity. They just were like, you're so American. Like the way I talk, the way I act, the way blah, blah, blah. So I think it's always good to kind of zoom out from our like day-to-day perspectives, especially we've had our reality checked by many of our guests that are not American, that we're very self-centered in the way that we think about the world. But when you zoom out from just like being in our day-to-day shoes of like in the US, we are deeply American, no matter how much the Stop Asian Hate, blah, blah, things that are going on that are dividing us. I think at our core, you and I are way more American than we are anything else, just by the fact of having been born there, raised there, like kind of shaped our whole lives there.
I think I hear what you're saying, and I mean that like that heritage doesn't belong to us, because I kind of feel like the wave of Asian immigration that kind of transformed the culture that we're part of now didn't exist necessarily before our parents immigrated there. So I kind of just feel like that heritage was a mix of all the people that were already there, but it didn't necessarily, like, that's not something that I feel like I inherited. But I think we also differ in the sense that, like, I don't necessarily think a lot about being American, and you have like much more, I think you have a much more fleshed out idea of what that means to you. And even like something like, and something that I've noticed when I travel abroad is when people ask me where I'm from, I tell them like where I live community wise. So like the most close region or whatever, I'll be like, I live in New York. Or when I lived in California, like I'm originally from California. I don't necessarily tell people like, hey, I'm American. And I think there's a difference there, because I don't identify very strongly with the idea of being American, if that makes sense, even though it's like hard to say like what is that picture, because it's different for everybody, right? If you ask you have a very clear picture. Someone else from the South might have a very different picture. But for me, I don't really have much of a picture of what that looks like. So,
well, I think that also kind of goes along with what we already mentioned at the top with kind of like federal versus state level, because one of the reasons, I guess, that we think there's such a difference between US and other countries from that standpoint is that each state has such a strong identity, and you could just identify with the state's culture and vibe as opposed to like the whole nation. So I guess that's probably what you're saying and what you just laid out. For me, I understand why you do that. I used to do that too, or I still do that sometimes, but I think that's because we're lucky enough to be from states that on a global scale people know. Like if you were from like even states that we know, like that aren't like bumfuck nowhere, but like if you're like, I'm from Connecticut or whatever, like an average like global citizen does not know what Connecticut is. So you'd have to say the US or like close to New York, right? Like you'd have to like anchor it on something. So I just
tri-state area.
Nobody the fuck knows what tri-state area is if you're not from the tri-state area. I'd never heard that phrase before going to NYU. So yeah, I think I just try to make it easier for people. So I start with like America, the biggest thing they definitely know. And then if they know anything about the US, then, I can zoom in a little bit more. But yeah, I think it's because we're already coastal people. So you're lucky enough to be able to say somewhere that you do identify with more, that someone actually would know what it is on like a global scale.
Yeah. I just feel like, yeah, I think what you're identifying is correct. Like, I feel more strongly about my life and my community in New York than I do more strongly about my life and my community as an American. And so I think when people ask me that, that's usually what I default to. It's not to say that, like, I don't recognize that there are tons of benefits in growing up in the US, and there are still many ongoing benefits that I think a lot of us reap. It's just that I don't know, I'm not proud of it because I feel like I haven't contributed anything to it. If that makes sense, does that make sense? Like, I feel like here I can say like I've contributed something to being a New Yorker because I volunteer, I pay taxes here, I vote for like very specifically public officials here. Like I feel like I'm much more invested in where I am than I am necessarily overall as the country. And so like I don't feel a ton of ownership over that.
But I guess that's where it's kind of like it depends on how you see it, which is like we don't live in the whole country. We live in like one specific place. So you can't unless you are a federal government official, you can hardly have an impact on like a national scale of anything, really. Like you can only do what you can in your local community, and that doesn't make it not American. I think it's just that everyone's kind of idea of what America means is based on where they grew up. So like it is, the state has like a very strong influence on what you deem as American. I guess it's just interesting to me that you abstract, you say like, oh, I'm very involved in like the New York community, but not American. It's like, New York is America. It's like part of America. Yeah. So you're like, but it's your version of your American community, you know?
Yeah. It's what I can see and what I can touch and what I can feel and what I experience. I can't say that I've experienced the rest of what America is. And so for me, this part of where I am is the majority of my American experience, if that makes sense. And because it is, and because I recognize that it's not the America thing, like the full thing, I say it's the New York experience, and that's why I don't think
I wonder also if it's because you haven't traveled to that many states, because I think I've traveled to a lot more states than you have.
Maybe.
So I have like a bigger view of what America means in a lot of different states. Not that I've spent like months in every state, but like I've visited a lot of states, and ones that are kind of like random as well. Like during business school, we went to like the Kentucky Derby. You know what I mean? Like, you know, and like, because we were in Illinois, we also went to Wisconsin, like random. And I went on the Chinese bus tour with my parents, like Wyoming and like Montana and like random places. So I've seen a lot of different reflections in New Orleans, Louisiana, South Carolina, all those, Florida. Like I've seen what it can be in all those different places. So for me, I can kind of like patchwork together that there's like so many different reflections of America, but there is just this like kind of underlying thing that I still feel. So maybe that's part of it as well, that like you're mostly California and New York experiences, so it's harder to piece together like the rest of the country in your head.
Maybe. I think it's like about it, the camaraderie and relationship aspect of it, I think is actually it's a very good point, because I don't think it's necessarily just about visiting for me, because I mean, I haven't visited for very long periods of time either, but I've been to a few states. I think it's just that like I couldn't tell you that I have like a friend in Montana, or like I know somebody who lives in Utah necessarily. And because I don't have relationships to people who live in those areas, I don't necessarily have that experience that you're talking about of like feeling this underlying like, hey, we're kind of the same. It's more kind of just like, it's a little bit of a blank for me. Yeah, makes sense. I think that is something that's kind of interesting to me, is that like when we talk about tourism too, like for some reason a lot of Americans never tour our own country. Like the first idea is like, let me get the fuck out of here. I know the US so well. Meanwhile, we're like a fucking massive country with so many different land like differences, culture differences and stuff, and if you never like check it out, even like the national parks, right, are like so fucking magical. And people really don't go to them as much as like they'd rather go to like Italy and like blah blah blah, because it sounds more like blah blah, you know, hoorah than staying it's a
in the
full
US.
Shebang than being at home.
I think we're underrated from a tourism standpoint.
No, I totally agree with you. There are tons of states and parks and places in the US that I would really like to go to. And they just haven't gotten around to it yet. Maybe this year. This year.
Well, I want to wrap back to something you mentioned, because like I said, you said so many things in your thing. And I was like, oh, I want to talk about it. So I won't comment on the political situation, because as you said, it's just kind of like bleh, we're still bleh. Like we're less like embarrassing, but still bleh. But something that has, it hasn't like it didn't chip at my pride of being American. I guess it just made me kind of like sad, is that I do feel like our country is dividing a lot more than it was before. Like, I think the left right division has always been there, and like I don't actually know if it's stronger of a divide than it was before, or if it's just that now, again, we're being bombarded by news, and like it's just like news cycle is really feeding into it. So who knows? But what has happened in the last 2 years? It is George Floyd happened. All the Asian violence happened. Like, a lot of other things have happened socially that have like split our country a lot more. And it is also, I can't abstract the like digital, social, news nature of all of that happening at the same time. But for me, the feeling is like we've never been this fragile in like a societal standpoint as we are kind of now, because we're in this weird place, right? Like, all the like social stuff that happened, the racial stuff that happened, it's difficult to kind of grasp, right? Because you're like, theoretically, we're trying to highlight and celebrate the differences in all of us, and to kind of like help everyone educate each other on like why these differences are awesome, right? As opposed to things that should be torn down or like looked down on and all that stuff. But there's this fine line that I think we have not grasped, which is like, by highlighting all these differences, there's this other wave where it's like people are kind of trying to highlight the differences in a way of saying like, you and I are different, we're not the same, you will never understand, you will never be blah blah blah. So it's like, if the goal was like mutual understanding and mutual kind of shared everything, I think what's really happening is that there's a lot of kind of like, now you versus me, and like, you'll never get it, so now I hate you. Like, there's a lot of this kind of like crackage that I see happening in our societal fabric that is like, I don't know how we're really going to overcome that in the near future. And it kind of scares me, honestly, because I'm like, like I said, the whole shtick of the U.S. originally was like melting pot, and like, we're stronger together because we're merging all these different things. Mm-hmm. And now I think it's saying like, almost like, oh, we shouldn't merge, we should just like recognize separate things and like somehow still be together, even though we're like kind of just separating things. I don't know.
I agree with you, and I really don't see, I mean, it's really hard to find a common ground in those situations where you no longer feel people are hearing you necessarily. And I think that where I would have loved to see it is like, we recognize we're different, we want to celebrate your differences. I recognize that I'm never going to have the lived experience of an African American. That individual is never going to have the lived experience of me. That doesn't mean that we don't necessarily want certain things that kind of overlap. But I think what you're pointing towards is that like, when those differences exist and people are like, you can't possibly understand me, they also think that the underlying needs are so fundamentally different that there can't be like a commonality there. And I think that that's fundamentally the problem, is that like, people are so absorbed in their own, I don't know what you want to call it, their own like grouphood. I don't want to call it community, because that's not what a community is about. It's not supposed to be exclusionary. People are so absorbed in their own like grouphood that sometimes it's hard to soften up and hear from other people, and recognize that like fundamentally what you want is the same. But I do feel like, because of how incendiary politics are and like speech has been, it is also really hard to reconcile certain things, right? Like, I feel like we've discussed this before, like the government in the past, although there were divisions on social issues, like generally it felt like there was still kind of like an air of respectability for your colleagues working in the government, regardless of like which side of the aisle that they're on. And I feel like that has kind of disappeared, for better or for worse. Like, and that just creates an environment where nothing gets done and like nobody wins. So, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's really hard as a citizen when you see that kind of like divisiveness on like the highest levels of the government to be like, oh, now I'm personally going to set a good example, or like I'm personally going to be invested in this thing, because what you see is just kind of like a mess. So like what's your incentive to like rise above it or care about something when you're like, this is just like a dumpster fire a little bit. And I think that's...
Yeah. It's interesting because obviously Trump changed the way that the US was seen both outside of our country and within our country, just from like a kind of symbology standpoint of like what our country stands for and the way we should act with each other and whatever. Because whether you supported him or not, the way that he acted was a lot more, as you said, kind of like incendiary, right? Like he kind of just like said whatever he wanted to say in a non-polished like way, which is what we're used to from government officials, which is like, even if they were thinking similar things like you're an idiot, they would say it in a more kind of like contained and like PC way to their opponents, versus he's gone now, right? Like I think there's a lot of things, like especially when we were talking about this topic 2 years ago when he was still president, it was really easy to kind of say like, oh, it's all Trump's fault, like everything's Trump's fault. It was very easy. Everyone was just kind of saying like blah blah blah, Trump Trump Trump. He's gone now. I think whether you want to like attribute it to like that kind of like extreme personality having a ripple effect into how government is run today, or if it would have been like this anyway, I do agree with you that there is this just like lower level of decorum that exists now in terms of the way that like government officials that are like the leaders of our nation act now. And it's difficult because I think for me it's almost like pre-Trump times, as you said, government was just kind of boring, right? It was just kind of like, whatever, this is the thing we need. But technically this is the thing in control, but like it doesn't have like a daily impact on my life because it's not even reported on as often, and I just like barely keep up with it. And now it's almost like you're so wrapped up in these personalities of the government officials and what they represent from like a human level that you get really attached to like, oh, well, like his personality is something I gravitate towards, or is something like I hate. So now I like feel really strongly one way or another about this issue because of the like personality of this person, as opposed to the actual issue at hand and whatever. It's just like, it's all become a lot more theatrical, I think. And I don't like that.
Well, no, I think that like it serves a purpose, right? Because what both parties saw with Trump is that kind of dialogue really motivated a certain kinds of people to go do stuff. And so they've taken that on because they're like, oh, this is a really effective way to drive people to certain actions. But it's kind of like, you know, parts of what he started, he kind of lost control of. And that's a little bit, I think, what's also happening with many of the party leaders. And you're talking about fragmentation. I agree that there is a huge divide between what you want to consider as left and what you want to consider as right. But even within each sect, there's a huge divide. So like the Republican Party, the majority of those people that are in Congress, I don't think that they reflect the overall Republican voter base anymore, whatever that looks like. Like they reflect, I think like those people reflect kind of this, for me, this like old money Wall Street conservative kind of person, and a large majority of the base is like poor white trailer trash. It's not the same anymore.
And similarly on the Democratic side.
On the Democratic side, yeah.
I would say the loudest voices, for example, like AOC, don't represent like a huge portion of the Democratic Party, but because she's such a cult of personality, it's easy to assume that the entire like Democrat Party is similar to that. But it's even within the elected officials, there's like most of them are not like as extreme as she is in terms of the way that she kind of positions herself. But she's just like so emblematic because she's young and she knows how to use social, and she's like
all that stuff. But like I agree with you. I think there is also significant fragmentation within the Democratic Party, right? Because there's people who are, I think, still very much aligned to what the core values of the party were, I'd say like the 90s, early 2000s. And then there are like many other groups who are like maybe more right-leaning, maybe looking for like even more progressive or radical ideas to be established in the government. So I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form that this is only happening on the Republican side. It is very much happening on the Democratic Party side as well.
Wow, I didn't think, honestly, even though this topic is about America, I didn't think we were going to talk about politics this much. Lols.
Well, I will say that, like, I don't know about other countries, but I do feel like one of the main things that is interesting about America is the significant navel gazing. We love to talk about America, and we are concerned with all things American. And that is part of why I think like people love being here. The participation in what America is or could be, I think is like for those people who care is like on another level. I don't know if everybody cares, you know, like the whole voting rate is like necessarily compared to like other countries, but I think the people who care very strongly, and I don't know if you necessarily find that in other countries.
Do you think there's a level of imposter syndrome in why we act like this? Because part of me feels
we're not a real country.
We're not a real country. Yeah, no, because other countries get to just fall on the fact that they were just like born as that country largely, of like, you know, whatever. History is very long. There have been many different like takeovers, but I just mean like the modern day countries that exist right now have at least been in existence of a certain culture for like way longer than the US has existed, and they were just kind of like it was just like that was just what it was, as opposed to like we had to like make a thing and we're trying to like prove to ourselves that the thing is working. So we're like constantly trying to like grasp onto the thing we thought we made. You know what I mean?
No, I totally hear you. I mean, it's kind of like the same way that we're talking about our identities. Like I feel like if we had been born into, you know, if we were born in Taiwan, we wouldn't question it so much. But because our identities are in effect new and kind of like in a state of flux, being built by us, it's something that we talk about a lot and we navel gaze about. And I think I definitely agree with you. Like that's part of why there's so much conscientiousness about what America is, because it's not rooted in like thousands of years of history. It's very like in two more of our lifetimes that's like 50%, that's like we're at what, 200 something years. So yeah, in the lifetimes of two more people, let's say assume each person lives to 100, it'll be double the age of our country, and it's only like 2 more generations past.
Crazy.
So it's very malleable, I think, and that's why people are so obsessed with controlling what the narrative of America looks like.
Yeah. Wow. All right. Shall we switch on to the fortune cookie close?
Yes.
Okay, so we wanted to share one thing that made us proud. Why did we write this? Something that made us
I'm proud to be an American. I'm free.
There you go. What made us proud to be American this year?
This year, 2022. I mean, oh gosh, I'm sorry.
Okay,
do you want to go
let's
first?
let's not do calendar year, because we're still like early in the. For those listening, we're recording currently May 4th, so like we're like not even halfway through the year. So let's make it like you know, roll the last rolling 12 months as opposed to like.
I was like really confused at first because I was like, May 4th. It's May 3rd.
Oh, sorry, y'all. I'm in the future because I'm in the fucking Asian side of the world.
Oh my God, that's so funny.
In Korea right now.
So I think I mentioned this before, but I think during the pandemic, there were a lot of situations where the better angels of people came out to play as opposed to the devils. And we saw a lot of I think really uplifting news about like people helping out other people without asking for anything in return. We saw a lot of kind of self-forming community groups that would help out people who like elderly people or people who otherwise couldn't help themselves out. And we just saw a lot of like I think individual citizens organizing to fill in gaps where the government or elected or like whatever was just not providing what was needed for the community. And I think that's like a really maybe it's not uniquely American, but I do think that that's one of the great things about living in America is that people will come and really pitch in and show their better selves in a pinch. On the other side, on the more personal, more selfish side, I mean, at the end of the day, like, we're all capitalists regardless of like, like I have more like socialist leaning social concepts, but at the end of the day, like, I want to make money, I want to get paid, I want to like live my fancy ass lifestyle. And so being here is obviously a boon to me because I can basically set my own pace on like how fast I can grow or how slow I can grow because it's more or less ish a meritocracy. So thank you, capitalism, for my lifestyle.
Thanks, Jeff Bezos. Just kidding.
He's not capitalism.
I mean,
he could be. He could be like the avatar.
Don't you think Amazon is the fabric of capitalism?
That's true. Like extreme capitalism.
He's like 60% of the economy. No,
oh God, Jesus.
Lols. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I guess mine are kind of selfish and weird as well. Not as well. Mine are selfish and weird. The first one is similar to yours about like the opportunities. So I guess being American, as I said, is like one of the ways that you have the most freedom to kind of like do whatever the fuck you want. And so I've already mentioned this many times, but like the fact that I could just like say like, I'm going to quit my job and I'm just going to like do this podcast full time and like travel and like make my own schedule and like make content and shit. And that's like a job to be seen if I make money, but like I have the freedom to make that choice and like to live that kind of a life. I don't think it would have been as easy to do that as a different kind of like as a non-American. Like, yes, there are content creators in other parts of the world, but I think there's a much higher societal like tide going against you in terms of like disapproval and like it just not being the norm versus like when I tell people now, it's still not like they're like, oh, I know like a million people that are doing similar things, but they're like, oh, that's cool. And like, it's generally a more kind of encouraging attitude towards it as opposed to like, why the fuck would you do that? Which is more of what my parents are saying because they're from the other generation. The other side of the world is where they grew up. Yeah. So that's one. The other, which is like weird because I was like, does this count as like the being American thing? But I think it does because it's again showing that America is a reflection of a lot of different things and a lot of different cultures and a lot of different types of people. Everything Everywhere All at Once has not dropped a single like dollar in box office revenue from a weekly standpoint in the last like several weeks. And it's still like topped in the box office.
Amazing.
And yes, incredible, totally deserved. But why I am so proud of that and why I like attribute that to like America and like being proud of America is like we are finally progressing as a country to be more reflective of all different types of people that make up this country, that we don't have to all look a certain way, we don't have to all act a certain way. And I don't need to recap our entire episode about that movie, but just the fact that like they were Asian, but it wasn't about being Asian, but they weaved in little things about their Asian lives just because they were Asian, and that it did not deter anyone. If anything, it kind of like made people more interested and more invested in the plot because they were complex characters. That is what makes me really happy and hopeful for being American moving forward. I saw a demographic breakdown that Asian people, like Asian Americans, only made up 20% of the viewership of that movie, which means that 80% of the viewers are non-Asian. So it's not about being Asian. It means that people can be attracted to really good content about human stories, and humans are made up of all different people who look all different ways. So that made me really proud to see that, of like, okay, we're slowly advancing as a society to be like truly more kind of like open-minded, inclusive, and willing to connect at that human level, which is what I really hope for our country moving forward, is like figuring out how to get back to that human connection, no matter how many things on the outside make us different.
Yes, and thanks to capitalism, maybe studios execs will see what you see too. The money's there, girl.
It's true. Ain't no indie, corner movie that no one's going to watch. It's
yeah.
Doing good, yeah.
All right, listeners. Well, we hope you enjoyed another edition of Red, White, and You. We would love to hear from you if you have any thoughts, comments, questions, if you'd like to share a story with us about your own American experience and how you do see yourself or you don't see yourself as American or what have you. Feel free to write us in at telluswhereyou'refrom@gmail.com or reach out to us on any of the socials.
Yes. And as I mentioned, we are taking a break for a few weeks so that we can recharge and come up with awesome new topics to discuss on this show. We'll let you know when we are coming back. But in the meantime, I'm still in Asia. I'm still traveling around. I'll be making lots of social content. So follow us on our socials to keep up with us there. And until next time, 再见, bitches.